The Georgia July heat hung thick over Aunt Linda's backyard, sticky enough to cling to Alara Voss's linen sundress and the vinyl armrests of her lightweight manual wheelchair. Smoke curled off the charcoal grill by the patio, mixing with the sweet, cloying scent of peach cobbler cooling on a folding table, and the yard hummed with the overlapping chatter of 3 generations of Vosses, cousins chasing each other through oak shade, uncles arguing over college football, her mother's shrill laugh cutting through every other noise. Alara had parked her chair at the edge of the lawn, far enough from the chaos to ease the constant burning nerve pain that crept up her thighs, close enough that no one could accuse her of hiding away or being rude. She'd come today with a quiet, fragile hope tucked in the canvas pouch slung over her chair's back, that maybe, after 2 years of relentless teasing, this reunion would be different. Her brother Jax found her 10 minutes later, a half-empty beer can loose in his grip, jaw tight with the familiar resentment she'd grown used to reading on his face. He'd never bothered to mask it, not since the car crash that left her partially paralyzed. Not since the insurance settlement had hit their family's shared bank account. Everyone let him get away with his sharp jabs, called it sibling banter, said he was just stressed holding down the family hardware store while she sat around collecting disability checks. Alara usually bit her tongue, told herself he didn't understand the searing, unrelenting pain that made walking more than a few steps impossible. Today, she'd planned to hand over the thick binder of MRIs and nerve conduction tests she'd brought, to make him see the proof laid out in black and white. She never got the chance. Quit putting on a show for everyone, Jack snapped, stopping directly in front of her wheelchair, his voice loud enough to draw the eyes of nearby cousins. You don't need that. You're just faking it so Mom and Dad coddle you. Alara's throat tightened. Jax, you don't know what you're talking about. My scan? Before she could finish, his palm slammed hard into the metal frame of her wheelchair's right armrest. The force sent the lightweight chair skidding sideways across the warm Bermuda grass, its small front wheels catching on a tree. Alara's balance snapped instantly. She toppled sideways out of the seat, her hips slamming into the packed earth hard enough to make white-hot agony shoot down her spine. Her hands scraped raw against the grass and tiny pebbles as she did. One leg twisted awkwardly beneath her, useless to catch her. The wheelchair tipped beside her, its wheels spinning uselessly in the... A beat of stunned silence stretched across that patch of... Then a cousin heard. Another aunt huffed, shaking her head like Alara had staged the whole mess for attention. Soon 6 family members were chuckling, murmuring about dramatic tantrums and overblown injuries. None of them stepping forward to help her stand. None of them checking if she'd hurt herself. Her mother stood a few feet back, sipping tea, her expression more embarrassed than... Her father clapped Jax on the shoulder like he'd pulled off a harm. No one saw the man lingering at the back of the half hidden by a tall tree, a leather medical folder clutched in. Dr. Hale, Alara's neurologist, the guest she'd begged to come with her for more support. He'd agreed to tag along after she'd broken down crying over the phone before, terrified the family would wear her down with their mockery all. Dr. Hale stepped forwardly, his leather loafers crunching over dry grass until he stood between Alara's crumpled form and the He cleared his throat once, steady, and every chuckle died mid-breath. The yard went quiet again, all eyes snapping to him, confused, offensive. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout accusations at Jax, or the family that had joined. He simply fixed his gaze on the entire group, and spoke 5 sharp, unshakable words that unraveled every lie they'd comforted themselves with for 2. Her paralysis is... The air turned heavy. The smile slid off every face one by one. Jax's cheeks deep red, the beer can slipping from his fingers to clatter on the grass. His confident sneer into shock, then panic, as the weight of the doctor's witness statement settled over him. This wasn't Alara's word against his anymore. This was a board-certified specialist, who'd tracked her spinal lesion through every scan, who'd documented her daily pain flares, who'd watched her struggle through physical therapy week after week, standing right there to confirm every ache she'd ever tried to explain away. No one could brush it off as overreaction or now. Alara on the grass, tears stinging her eyes not just from the fresh pain in her hip, but from the crushing humiliation of being mocked while she was hurt, from the cold realization that not a single person she'd grown up with had chosen to believe her until a stranger with a medical degree. Dr. Hale knelt at her carefully, gentle as he slid an arm around her shoulders to help her shift into a less-threatening position, his gaze soft with sympathy. He didn't waste a glance on the rest of the family as quietly to her, only, I've got you. We don't have to minute. Her mother pushed through the circle of a second later, setting her sweet tea down roughly on a picnic table, her tone sharp and accusatory instead of apologetic. Ridiculous, Alara. You provoked him over there alone. Jackson to knock you over. You need to apologize for making us sieves. Alara stared up at her mother, the last thread of completely. For 2 years, begged for understanding, brought medical records to dinner, cried through conversation about her limited mobility, and still, her parents chose Jax's reckless cruelty over her lived pain. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, wincing at the blow on her damaged spine. I'm not apologizing for anything. Not ever again. Dr. fetched her tipped wheelchair, righting it and brushing grass clippings off the seat before he let her slide back into place, steadying her shoulder safely. He grabbed her canvas medical binder off the lawn fallen during the shove, tucking it securely into the chair's storage pouch, then gripped the push handles to wheel her toward the driveway without another word. Stunned family behind them. No one moved them as they crossed the yard, past silent staring aunts and sheepish cousins, past who stood frozen on the grass, meet her eyes. They pulled out of Aunt Linda's driveway 10 minutes later. Ilara staring out the passenger window at the sprawling backyard shrinking in the rearview mirror, her hip throbbing steadily through the meds she'd taken that morning. Her phone buzzed once in her purse, a text preview lighting up before she could look away. A message from her mother, sent Lester they'd left the property. The words to her chest as she read them. If you don't pack things up with Jax by this weekend, we're cutting off all financial help. You'll lose the egg for your apartment. Ella locked the screen without responding, turning to stare out the window at the endless pine trees lining the highway, a hollow heavy dread settling deep in her bones. The read hadn't just ruined one afternoon. It had cracked open every unspoken lie built around her disability, and whatever fragile piece she'd clung to with them was gone for good. The fluorescent lights inside Dr. Elias Hale's neurology clinic hummed a low, constant drone the next morning, cooling Ilara's sunburnt arms where the July heat had lingered from the reunion. She'd barely slept through the night, her bruised hip throbbing in sharp pulses every time she shifted in bed, replaying the sound of her family's laughter as she crumpled onto the grass on a loop behind her eyelids. Dr. Hale had insisted she come in first thing for a quick nerve scan to rule out aggravated spinal damage after Jax's shove, and he'd left a paper copy of his formal witness statement on the exam room counter while he stepped out to grab her medical files, black-type text detailing every second he'd watched Jax strike her wheelchair, every mocking laugh he'd heard from the crowd. Ilara ran a trembling finger along the edge of the printed statement, her gaze drifting to the thick canvas binder she'd dragged to the reunion, the one that had spilled MRIs, pain logs, and specialist notes across Aunt Linda's lawn when her chair tipped. All that proof, neatly tabbed and labeled, and none of her blood relatives had bothered to glance at it before they'd written her off as a fraud. She'd carried it for months, clinging to the naive thought that tangible medical paperwork could fix the rift between her and her family, that cold scans and test results would outweigh Jax's bitter accusations and her parents' willful ignorance. By the time Dr. Hale returned to the room, she'd already made up her mind. She was taking that binder straight to her childhood ranch house that afternoon, and she would force her mom and dad to read every page. Dr. Hale reviewed her new scan results with a quiet, grave tone, confirming the shove had inflamed her chronic nerve damage, but no permanent new harm had been done. He slid a manila envelope across the counter filled with full-color diagnostic images, stamped and signed by his practice, and pressed his witness statement into her hand alongside. This isn't just for show, he told her, leaning against the exam table, his voice. If they refuse to acknowledge what happened yesterday, this paperwork gives you tangible standing to draw firm boundaries. You don't owe them endless patience while they dismiss your reality. Ilara, tucking the envelope and witness statement inside the binder's front pocket before she wheeled herself out of the clinic parking lot and headed 20 minutes west toward the neighborhood where she'd grown up. The Voss family ranch sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a single-story home with narrow front steps, and her parents had never bothered to insist, even after her crash 2 years prior, always brushing off her requests as unnecessary fuss. She parked her accessible sedan along, heaved the heavy binder over lap, and wheeled up to the porch, tapping her knuckles against the screen door until her mother Margaret put in, her face tight with approval. The second she laid out, Troy, her father, was lingering in the kitchen behind her, wiping down the counter with a dish towel, and Jax's beat-up pickup truck sat parked driveway, confirming he was inside. Margaret stepped aside to let Ilara rolling room, not offering a single word of apology for the bruise blooming dark purple across her hip, jumping straight to the argument she'd started over text night before. You had every chance to call last night and smooth things with your brother, she said, crossing her arms. This stubbornness isn't active, Ilara. Jax was just frustrated. Ilara didn't let herself shrink back the way she always had fights. She set the thick binder down on the coffee between them, flipping it open to reveal stacks of imaging reports and handwritten pain journals, sliding Dr. Hale's signed witness statement across the wood toward her parents. Frustration doesn't give him the right to shove me out of my wheelchair and for the whole family, she said, her voice calm. This binder holds 2 years of proof that my injury act. Dr. Hale's statement confirms every part of what happened at the. I brought this here hoping to listen. Troy tossed his dish towel onto the counter and knelt to flip lazily through a few eye sheets, barely glancing at the black-white scans, before he closed the binder again and pushed it away from him, like burned his palms. We've seen all these papers before, he grunted. You can stand for short stretches, push yourself. Jax thinks you lean on that chair too much to avoid pitching in business. A cold, sinking feeling set in Ilara's stomach as she watched her father dismiss her medical record and thought. But she pushed forward, determined to get every unspoken truth out into the open. I can stand for 90 seconds max before my legs lock up, and the nerve bearable. I've explained that dozens of times. The disability checks luxury spending money. They cover physical therapy and pain medication otherwise. Margaret cut her off sharply, her tone of ness. That settlement money from the car crash was supposed to be split even you and Jax. Instead, you hoarded every cent, leaving him stuck covering all her overtime alone. Of course he's bitter. The word hit Alara like a blow, and she froze, staring at her in stunned disbelief. No one had ever mentioned splitting her personal injury settlement before, in 2 years. Split it? That money was compensation for my medical bills, permanent mobility loss, and lost graphic design business income, by legal right. Troy shifted his weight, avoiding her eyes as he admitted the secret hidden for over a year. We moved $38,000 out of that last spring. Jax needed a new work for the hardware store, and we paid for his management promotion training with the rest. We figured you wouldn't notice. You don't have the same daily as. Ilara's fingers tightened around the wheelchair's armrest till her knuckles whitened. All this time, the resentment Jax carried, all the mocking and cruel jabs at the reunion, it had been fueled by a lie her own parents had fed him, by stolen funds they'd taken with a single conversation with her. They'd hidden tens of thousands that belonged to her, then turned around and acted like she was selfish for relying on ability support to survive. There was no use showing them more or witness statements now. They'd already chosen their son's comfort over safety. She gathered all paperwork back into the binder, zipping the canvas pouch closed and lifting it onto her lap. I thought coming here might make you see the truth. But it's clear you've already made up your minds, she told them quietly, thinning her throat. I won't attend any more family gatherings unless banned from being around me. I can't risk being hurt again, and I won't subject myself to his harassment while excuse it. Margaret's face anger at the ultimatum, opening to fire off another retort. Lara didn't wait to hear it. She pulled herself back through the front door, ignoring her mother's raised voice calling her ungrateful, and locked the binder safely in the trunk of her car before driving back to Plex. The sun was dipping low behind the apartment buildings. She pulled into her parking spot, her mind still reeling from the revelation about the stolen settlement funds. She'd barely unlocked her front door when loud, furious bang exploded against the metal frame, echoing down the quiet hallway. Jax's voice roared through the wood, slurred and furious, screaming accusations that she'd lied about the settlement, that she'd ruined the reunion on purpose to make him look terrible. Neighbor doors creaked open down the hall. Curious is peeking out to watch the outburst, and Alara froze inside her entryway, heart hammering against her ribs as she realized her brother had tracked her down to her private home, ready to confront her alone. Alara pressed her back flat against the cold metal of her front door, every loud thud from Jax's fists rattling the deadbolt and sending sharp tremors up her already tender spine. Through the narrow peephole, she watched him pace the hallway, face red and contorted, fists balled tight at his sides as he shouted accusations loud enough to bounce off the cinder block walls. A gray-haired neighbor 2 doors down stood in her doorway, arms crossed, phone already lifted like she planned to record every second of the outburst. And that small, witnessing presence was the only thing stopping Alara's panic from fully swallowing her. She didn't dare unlock the door, didn't dare engage with him while his temper spiked out of control. Instead, she grabbed her cell phone off the entry table and dialed Marisol, her best friend and paralegal, fingers shaking so badly she misdialed twice before the call connected. Marisol picked up on the first ring, and the steady, no-nonsense tone of her voice immediately cut through Alara's fog of fear. Jax is outside my apartment screaming and pounding the door, Alara whispered, pressing her shoulder to the wall to muffle her words so Jax wouldn't hear. Neighbors are watching. I don't know how long he'll stay. Marisol didn't waste a single second on gentle comfort before laying out clear steps. Lock every interior door. Grab your wheelchair and move to the back bedroom, away from the hallway noise. I'm 10 minutes out, and I'll call the local non-emergency police line to file a trespass warning while I drive over. If he breaks anything or tries to force entry, hit 911 immediately. Alara followed the instructions blindly, rolling herself into the quiet bedroom at the rear of her unit and sliding the secondary deadbolt shut behind her. The sound of Jax's yelling growing distant but no less menacing. She set her phone on the night, keeping the call active so Marisol could listen to the commotion through the lane, and counting each shaky breath until she heard Marisol's car pull into the parking lot outside. Minutes later, the hallway thudding stopped. Marisol let herself into the apartment 20 seconds after that, a thick legal notepad tucked under one arm, her expression sharp and She found Alara hunched in her wheelchair on the bedroom floor, eyes glowing, and knelt down to squeeze her hand before explaining what she'd said. 2 uniformed officers would meet them at the precinct downtown within the hour to take a formal trespass. The neighbor with the phone footage had already agreed to ride along as a... At the police station B, fluorescent lighting washed out every warm tone of Alara's skin as she recounted the reunion shove, her parents' admission about the stolen settlement money, and Jax's unprovoked harassment at her private residence. The officer typed steadily, logging each detail into the report, and handed over printed temporary trespass paperwork once the statement. Once served, Jax would face misdemeanor charges if he returned to her apartment complex for a reason. No evidence. No sec. From the station, Marisol drove Alara straight to her small downtown office, a sunlit conference room lined with binders covering disability discrimination and family financial exploitation. She spread the trespass papers, Dr. Hale's mint, and Alara's stack of medical scans across the table, pulling out a typed formal notice addressed to Troy and Mark. The letter laid out Alara's non-negotiable. Jax was banned from all her property, all one-on-one contact, and any shared family events she chose to attend. If they refused to enforce this rule moving forward, Alara reserved full right to pursue legal action over the stolen settlement funds and the public assault. State civil statute over this, Marisol said, tapping a highlighted paragraph on a legal textbook in between them. Public ableist harassment and physical assault in front of witnesses counts as intentional emotion. Add the unauthorized withdrawal of your personal injury settlement, and you have 2 solid avenues for formal court filings if they refuse. Alara stared at the printed notice. For 34 years, she'd bent herself thin to keep family happy, swallowing her pain, dismissing cruel jokes, forgiving endless slights just to hold on to their love. Sitting in that conference room, with concrete legal protection out in front of her, she realized how much of herself she'd surrendered for people who would never choose to believe her over their son. Something in her chest. No longer the desperate need for validation, but a quiet, burning resolve to protect. They printed 3 signed copies of the boundary note that afternoon. One for Ara's records, one to mail to her parents a certified letter, and one to hand-deliver to the hardware store where Jax and Troy were morning. Marisol promised to accompany drop-off, refusing to let her. By sunset, Alara headed to her apartment, the trespass warning taped inside her kitchen cabinet for quick reference, the certified letter receipt confirmation text sent to her phone from the post office. Her phone buzzed an hour later with a long voice memo from her mother, shrill and furious, calling her selfish, dramatic, and ungrateful for pressing legal measure against her own blood. The fine deepest. Margaret announced she and Troy would no longer make their phone check-ins, cutting off all casual communication until Alara dropped this ridiculous Jax. Alara deleted them without replaying it, setting her down on the counter. The weekly calls had been her last fragile thread of routine to her parents, a small lifeline she'd clung to even through missile. Now that life severed completely, a permanent shift in their relationship she could no longer pretend to fix with a compromise. That night, as she prepared to climb into bed, an unfamiliar formal envelope slipped through the mail slot of her front door. She wheeled over to pick it up, peeling back the seal to find official letterhead from Voss Family Hardware's department. The typed summons ordered her to attend a mandatory closed-door business meeting in 48 hours, labeled as a formal review of her unclaimed financial assets tied. Alara folded the letter and set it beside a binder on the shelf, a cold in her stomach. Her parents and brother were done hiding secrets or pushing her to surrender what belonged to her, and the closed meeting at the hardware store meant they planned to corner her without neutral witnesses to argue over the stolen settlement money. The hum of power drills and the sharp tang of pine lumber filled the air of Voss Family Hardware the second Alara rolled through the glass front door 2 days after receiving the HR summons. Midweek customer traffic thinned out by late afternoon, and Troy's HR manager, a quiet middle-aged woman named Clara, waited beside the back office hallway, her expression tight and uneasy the moment she spotted Alara's wheelchair. She guided Alara past aisles stacked with paint cans and power tool displays to a small windowless conference room tucked behind the inventory stockroom, closing the door firmly once they stepped inside. Jax and Troy were already seated at the scuffed oak table, both leaning back in folding chairs with crossed arms, their body language defensive before Alara even said a word. A thick manila folder labeled Voss Family Shared Assets sat centered between them, and Alara's stomach twisted on sight of it. She already knew what papers lay inside. The proof of the $38,000 they'd siphoned from her crash settlement, without a single conversation or signature from her. Clara pulled out a spare chair and opened a blank notebook, explaining she was only present to mediate the financial discussion per store policy, not to take sides in family conflict. Before Alara could lay out her stack of medical paperwork and the certified boundary notice from Marisol, Troy cut her off, his voice gruff and unyielding. "We called you here to sort out this settlement mess once and for all," he said, tapping the manila folder hard with his knuckle. "Your mother and I agreed that money should have been split evenly between you and Jax from the start. You hoarded every dollar while he's stuck running this store 6 days a week to keep us afloat. It's only fair we took part of it to cover his truck and management Alara's fingers tightened around her wheelchair armrest, every old wound of dismissal flaring fresh all over again. She slid a copy of her personal injury settlement contract across the table toward The legal wording bolded at the top stating all compensation was exclusively for her medical recovery, lost business income, and permanent disability accommodations. Fair? She kept her tone, though quiet anger vibrated beneath every. That money wasn't family inheritance. It was payment for the 2 years I spent bedridden after my spinal injury, for thousands in physical therapy bills, for the graphic design studio I lost because I couldn't stand long enough to run client meetings. You had no legal or moral right to withdraw a cent without my written permission. Jack slammed his palm against the table, the sound making Clara jump at feet. His face flushed with the same bitter resentment Alara had seen at the reunion, the anger that had driven him to shove her out of her wheelchair and pound on her apartment door daily. You act like you're the only one here, snapped, leaning forward to glare at her. Mom and Dad spent thousands covering your doctor's co-pays before that settlement. I work overtime every weekend to pick up the slack you can't handle around me, and you sit in that chair collecting checks like you're entitled to everything. I pushed you at the reunion because I was sick of watching everyone coddle your fake disability while I carry. The confession hung thick in this room, heavy enough to choke her. He'd known exactly how permanent her. He'd seen her struggle to shuffle short distances with races, heard her cry through bad pain flares at family dinners, watched her haul stacks of medical paperwork to every holiday gathering. He'd lashed out at her fully aware every cruel accusation he shouted lie, fueled purely by jealousy over funds that had never belonged to him. Troy spoke up to back his son instantly, dismissing Alara's settlement contract without a read-through. You made the choice not to push through the physical therapy hard enough to walk. That settlement money becomes shared family property the second you refuse to contribute your fair. Alara her father, stunned by how thoroughly he'd rewritten reality to justify stealing her compensation. All the years she'd spent trying to connect with them, all the quiet pleas they're standing, none of it had mattered against their preference to shield Jax from any sense of accountability. There was no room left for compromise, no chance they would voluntarily return the stolen funds. Clara closed her book softly, glancing between the three of them with. She told Troy she couldn't continue mediating if they refused to acknowledge the legal ownership of her settlement, and advised Alara to consult her legal representative to resolve the unauthorized withdrawals through civil channel. With that, excused herself, and left the three of them alone. Troy rose from his chair, gathering the family asset folder and tucking it under his arm like he was packing away a settled argument. If you keep this with legal threats, you'll never step foot in this door again. We don't need troublemakers stirring up drama for ours. Alara wheeled herself toward the door without either of them, her mind already racing ahead to call Marisol the second cleared the parking lot. There was no more waiting, no more attempts at patience. Her family had choice plain. They valued Jax's comfort and entitlement far more than bodily safety, financial security. By the time she pulled into her apartment parked an hour later, Marisol had cleared space on her schedule to start drafting civil recovery paperwork. Alara sat at her kitchen counter that evening, spreading out the settlement contract, bank withdrawal record her lawyer had requested, Hale's witness statement, and the trespass report filed against Jax, stacking every piece of evidence in an organized file folder. She dialed Marisol and told her to move forward with formal civil filings to reclaim the 38th. The next morning, Alara woke to a flood of notification phone screen. She tapped open Facebook to find a long, vicious public post written by Jax. Before. He claimed Alara fabricated her spinal injury to money from their parents, accused her of hoarding the car crash settlement to live lazily off disability benefits, and painted himself as the hard-done, responsible sibling forced to clean up her mess. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and distant cousins commented beneath the post, echoing his slander, calling her manipulative, and greedy. Every old ableist stereotype they'd whispered behind her back for 2 years, laid bare for the entire to read. Alara sat face down on the counter, hands cold. The financial fight was no longer just confined to closed office meetings at family houses. Jax had dragged their conflict into public view, launching a coordinated smear campaign to every relative against her, before her civil case even officially began. Alara's thumb hovered over the screen of her phone for a full minute, staring at Jax's unhinged Facebook post like it was a physical wound laid out in pixelated black text. Every line twisted the truth until it was unrecognizable. He framed her wheelchair as a calculated grift, the car crash settlement as a selfish cash grab, the shove at the reunion as a harmless prank she'd weaponized to punish him. Beneath the paragraph, a stream of comments from distant aunts, teenage cousins, and old high school friends piled on, repeating his lies without stopping to ask for her side of the story. Her chest ached, sharp and familiar, the same humiliation she'd felt sprawled on Aunt Linda's backyard grass all over again, amplified by hundreds of digital eyes watching and judging. She grabbed her jacket and wheelchair bag, locking up her apartment before driving straight to Marisol's downtown office, the weight of the public smear heavy behind her ribs. Marisol took one glance at the post, and immediately pulled up Georgia's civil defamation statutes on her desktop. scrolling to highlight clauses covering false written statements that harm a person's reputation and livelihood. Alara's freelance graphic design clients were local, many of them mutual acquaintances with the Voss family. If the slander spread far enough, she risked losing the only steady income she had outside disability assistance. "We have two paths here," Marisol explained, sliding a legal pad across her conference table. "First, we collect witness statements from everyone who saw what happened at the reunion to counter his narrative. Second, we gather proof of his public lies to add a defamation claim to your existing civil suit over the stolen settlement and the assault-induced emotional distress." Alara nodded, pulling out her phone to scroll through private messages she'd received overnight. To her quiet shock, 3 different cousins had reached out separately, sending quiet apologies for laughing alongside the rest of the family back in July. Each one admitted they'd watched Jax shove her hard enough to send her tumbling out of the chair, and they'd felt guilty ever since Dr. Hale spoke up to confirm her permanent paralysis. All 3 offered to write signed witness accounts detailing exactly what they'd seen, ready to submit them to Marisol for the court. Over the next 2 days, Alara coordinated video calls with each sympathetic cousin from her apartment living room, her medical binder spread open on the coffee table beside her. She pulled up digital copies of Dr. Hale's signed witness statement, her MRI, and the bank records proving Troy and Margaret had withdrawn $38,000 of her settlement without consent, sharing the unedited evidence with each relative. None of them had known about the stolens, and their outrage only solidified their willingness to stand with her against Jax and her. One cousin even captured screenshots of Jax's Facebook post in the cruel comment thread as additional digital evidence of Tin. Dr. Hale also sent over a cure digital folder to Marisol's legal portal that noon, filled with every 2 years of diagnostic imaging, nerve test results, and official pain documentation. The files carried his electronic medical signature, irrefutable proof that Alara's spinal injury was permanent and debilitating, not some performative act. Marisol organized every document into labeled digital folders, separating witness statements, medical evidence, financial records, digital defamation screenshots, and the police trespass report filed after Jax's apartment. As the evidence grew thicker, a permanent split tore through the extended Voss family. The relatives who'd signed witness statements began commenting, gently correcting misinformation on Jost, while other aunts and uncles doubled down on their loyalty to Troy, Martin, Jax, firing off defensive messages, calling Alara a traitor for dragging their family's private business into court. Long-standing holiday plans were canceled and right. Family group chats split into 2 separate threads, one side supporting Alara's fight for accountability, the other dismissing her as blood ties that had held for generations frayed completely over the court week. Alara felt a strange mix of grief and relief watching the. She'd spent decades craving full acceptance from every member of her family, desperate to fit in no matter how much they mean. Now that the line was permanently drawn, she no longer wasted energy trying to win over people determined to believe Jax's lies instead of tangible medical proof. She focused all her attention on the legal case, no longer clinging to the faint hope of a peaceful reconciliation with. 3 days after the face went live, Marisol called Alara into her office to findings. 2 separate formal complaints were ready to submit to the court. The first demanding full repayment of the $38,000 wrongfully withdrawn from Alara's personal injury settlement account, plus accrued interest and legal fees. The second filed charges for disability discrimination, intentional emotional distress stemming from the public reunion assault, and digital defamation caused by Jax's social media smear campaign. Every witness statement, medical scan, bank record, and screenshot of the Facebook post was attached as supporting exhibits. Organ judges review. Alara signed each page of the paperwork slowly, her handwriting steady despite the lingering nerve in her dominant hand. No turning back now. She had laid her evidence on the line, choosing to fight for her financial security and reputation, rather than surrender to manipulation. By that same day, a white court envelope arrived at Marisol's office, forwarded immediately to Alara via email. The notice stated a mandatory pre-trial mediation session had rolled 2 weeks away, requiring the physical presence of involved parties. Alara, Troy, Margaret, and Jax Voss, alongside their respective legal representatives and a neutral court mediator. No one allowed to skip the session, and all core conflict, the stolen settlement, the reunion assault, the trespassing harassment, social media defamation, would be addressed face to formal room. Alara closed the email and phoned down on the kitchen counter, staring out her apartment window at the quiet downtown street below. For months she'd been direct confrontation, trying to avoid hurting her family, even as they hurt her repeatedly. Now they would all be forced to sit in the same room, forced to confront every lie they'd built around her ability and her stolen money, with a neutral third party overseeing every word exchanged. The final showdown was locked into place, and they had to step away from it now. The county mediation office smelled of bland coffee and sterile copy paper, the low hum of overhead fluorescent lights filling the narrow conference room, where Alara wheeled herself to the table's far end, Marisol sitting steady at her side with an organized binder stacked high between them. The neutral court mediator, a calm middle-aged attorney named Ms. Reed, laid out ground rules before anyone else arrived. No shouting, no interruptions. Every piece of evidence would be reviewed collectively, and any binding settlement terms would require written signatures from all parties present. 30 seconds later, the door swung open. Troy, Margaret, and Jax filing in together as a tight, defensive unit, their own family attorney, trailing behind them with a thin folder that held almost no tangible paperwork, only handwritten notes from Jax, and a single bank printout the parents had dug up to justify the stolen settlement funds. Jax's jaw locked the second his eyes landed on Alara's wheelchair, his gaze sharp with unmasked resentment, while Margaret fixed her stare on the linoleum floor, unwilling to meet Alara's eyes at all. Troy pulled out a chair beside their lawyer, crossing his arms and settling into a posture that broadcast he planned to fight every demand Alara put forward. Ms. Reed opened the session by reading Dr. Elias Hale's full signed witness statement aloud. Every detail of the reunion assault laid out verbatim. Jax's verbal accusations of fraud, the forceful shove to the wheelchair, Alara's hard fall onto packed grass, the entire family's collective laughter before the doctor stepped forward to confirm irreversible spinal paralysis. The room went dead silent as the words hung in the air. Jax's knuckles whitened where he gripped the edge of his earlier hard-edged confidence crumbling fast. When the mediator finished reading, she turned directly to him and asked a simple, unescapable question. Did you know her permanent nerve and spinal damage was medically confirmed before you pushed her out of that wheelchair? Jax hesitated for a long beat, glancing desperately toward his parents for help. But neither Troy nor Margaret spoke a word to The weight of all the evidence stacked against him finally caved through his dull, and his voice cracked as he admitted the truth he'd hidden for 2 years. I knew the scans were real. I just couldn't stand watching her get money and sympathy, while I worked nonstop to keep the hardware store running. I took my frustration out on her. Margaret's shoulders sagged at his cannon, a quiet, defeated exhale slipping past her lips. For the first time since the union, she dropped the defensive act she'd clung to, her gaze flicking over to Alara's bruised hip still visible beneath her loose. Troy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, staring at the table rather than acknowledge the damage his favoritism had caused both. Marisol slid copies of the bank withdrawal logs across the table, marking the exact date the $38,000 had been pulled from Alara's injury settlement. The funds split to cover Jax's pickup truck payment and his store management train fees. The family's lawyer attempted to argue the funds were intended as shared family, but Ms. Reed him off, referencing the binding personal injury contract that clearly designated all compensation solely for Alara's medical recovery and lost livelihood. There was no legal loophole to excuse the unauthorized. Next came the digital defamation evidence, screenshots of Jax's public fund, the cruel comment thread from extended relatives, and signed witness statements from 3 cousins confirming the full sequence of events at the reunion, all contradicting every false claim Jax had posted online. Jax stared at the screen captures spread before him, no rebuttal to offer. He'd painted Alara as a manipulative fraud to dozens of members, and every witness and medical document proved every word of that post was a lie. As the media wore on, the full scope of the parents' enabling behavior unraveled. Margaret admitted she'd laughed off Jax's ableist jokes for years to avoid conflict, while Troy confessed he'd moved the settlement money without faulting Alara, because he'd assumed his daughter's disability meant she couldn't responsibly manage lots of cash. They'd fed Jax resentment by venting about Alara's disability benefits in conversations, never once correcting his false belief that she was faking her limited mobility. The pair finally acknowledged they'd chosen their son's feelings over their daughter's truth, a quiet admission that in them. Ms. Reed walked both legal teams through settlement terms, laying out options. Proceed like civil trial, where all private medical records and family conflict would become permanent public court record, or negotiate a binding mediated agreement with enforceable safety and financial terms. After a 20-minute huddle with their attorney, Troy, Margaret, and Jax returned to the table ready to compromise. The binding settlement they signed laid out 3 non-negotiable terms. First, the full $38,000 stolen settlement money, plus small accrued interest and half Alara's legal fees, would be repaid in 6 monthly installments per week. Second, a permanent no-contact safety order would remain active between Alara and Jax indefinitely. No in-person visits, no phone calls, social media messages, no third-party relaying of harsh comments through other fingers. Third, Troy, Margaret, and Jax were required to draft a formal, hand-signed written apology acknowledging the reunion assault, the settlement funds, and the harmful social media defamation, to be delivered to 7 days. All 4 parties initialed every page of the agreement before Ms. Reed filed a copy with the county court, closing the meeting for good. Alara wheeled toward the Marisol at her side, not glancing back at her family as they lingered at the table, their heads bowed under the weight of the consequences. A week passed before a plain white envelope arrived on Laura's apartment doorstep, marked from her parents' neighborhood. Inside sat the typed, signed apology letter the settlement had mandated, formal and hollow, no genuine word to the script. Tucked beneath the letter was a separate handwritten slip of paper, looping cursive. Words that erased any faint hope Alara had held of long term. I will never forgive you for dragging our whole family through public court embarrassment over argument. You chose legal fights over us, forgotten. Alara folded the note and set it aside on her kitchen counter, staring at the quiet street. The core conflict had its decisive resolution, but the emotional damage and unhealed. The financial debt and savings were settled on paper, yet the rift between her and her parent did not mend any time, if ever. Autumn light slanted soft through Alara's apartment balcony screen a month after mediation, burning off the brutal Georgia summer heat that had seared Aunt Linda's backyard the day Jax shoved her to the lawn. The 6 repayment installments had begun hitting her bank account on schedule, steady deposits from Troy's hardware store business account, each transfer accompanied by 0 notes, 0 calls, 0 attempts to reach out and bridge the gap they'd torn open between them. She'd already sent half the recovered $38,000 to renew her accessible apartment lease for another 2 years, eliminating the housing panic that had gnawed at her for months, and set aside the rest to rebuild her freelance graphic design brand, investing in ergonomic desk equipment that eased the strain on her spine during long work hours. She'd folded Margaret's bitter handwritten note into the back of her old medical binder, the same binder she'd once carried everywhere, desperate to make her family see the truth of her injury. It sat now on a high shelf in her new home office, filed away alongside Dr. Hale's witness statement, bank records, and the signed mediation settlement paper, proof of a fight she'd needed to wait, not a weight she had to carry every single day. Every piece of evidence that once felt like a weapon was now only a record of how far she'd had to push to protect herself. Marisol came over for dinner one Tuesday evening, bringing takeout peach barbecue and a stack of new client inquiries for Alara's design business. The inquiries pouring in after several sympathetic cousins had shared her portfolio across their local community social groups. They sat at the balcony table as dusk rolled, sipping sweet iced tea and talking through the quiet shifts rippling through the extended Voss family. Jax had turned down the store management promotion Troy had spent thousands training him. The monthly settlement repayments drained his disposable income, and the permanent no-contact order barred him from every family gathering Alara might attend. Margaret and Troy had put their old single-story ranch up for sale, downsizing into a small townhouse with no extra space for guests, no spare room that might have ever fit a wheelchair. They'd lost the soft, unconditional support of half their relatives, isolated by their choice to defend Jax's cruelty over their daughters. None of it brought Alara satisfaction. There was no triumph in watching her parents and brother unravel under the weight of their own choices. Only a quiet sadness for the childhood bond they'd shattered beyond repair. What she did feel was freedom from spending years shrinking herself to avoid upset. Freedom from begging for validation no one was ever willing to give. Freedom to stop apologizing for her disabled body and the medical care she needed to. 3 days after dinner, Alara packed a cardboard box full of old families. A chipped ceramic mug her mother had given her, framed childhood photos of her and Jax's kids, a leather tool set Troy had gifted her before the crash, back when they'd still spoken without resentment. She drove to her parents' new townhouse midday, set the box on their front step, and left without knocking or waiting for them. The quiet, foster, returning the pieces of the old family life she could no longer do. No demand for compensation, no plea for reconciliation. When she glanced in the rearview mirror she saw Margaret peek through the front curtain. But neither parent stepped outside her. Limited. Gentle contact only with the 3 cousins who'd submitted witness statements during mediation. They met monthly at a downtown lunch, spoke openly about the family's deep realism, and never pressured her to reckon with Troy, Marx. For the first time in her life, Alara had blood relatives who chose to believe her without medical scans or legal paperwork to force their empathy. The narrow, bitter family circle she'd grown up in had been ripped by a smaller, kinder one, built on respect. Dr. Hale stopped by her apartment one weekend to check in on her nursing progress, bringing a fresh set of updated imaging reports confirming her spinal damage remained stable. No new inflammation in the reunion fall, lingering after months of consistent medication and physical therapy. He leaned against the balcony railing beside her as she gripped the metal support bar along the edge, standing unassisted for well over a minute to watch the sunset paint the sky soft lavender. No burning spike of pain forcing her to sink into her wheelchair. 2 years prior, standing for even 30 seconds had left her gasping through what nerve flares. Slow, steady healing gifted her small, precious wins she'd never gotten to celebrate with. Doctor left. Alara rolled back into her home office and pulled a blank leather-bound sketch from her desk drawer, the page marked. She'd spent so long drawing designs for other people's businesses, Other people's lives. Other people's versions of success. Tonight, she picked up a charcoal pencil and began to sketch the outline of her apartment balcony. The bar beneath her fingers. The pine trees visible past the apartment complex. Her life, unfiltered, unapologetic. No longer defined by the lies her family had long. In the parking lot, a neighbor laughed as they loaded groceries into their car, sound light and warm, nothing like the cruel, mocking snickers that had echoed over the grass that July afternoon reunion. There were no stains on her jeans now, no scraped palms from hitting packed dirt, no tight knot of humiliation coiled in her chest waiting for someone to call her a fraud. The wheelchair beside her desk wasn't a symbol of weakness or performance for attention. It was the tool that let her move through on her own terms, and she no longer needed it. Alara set the pencil down and the half-finished sketch, a quiet, steady calm settling deep in her bones. The old family order was gone, fractured beyond, but a new, gentle unfurled in its place, one built on her own truth, her own boundaries, and the quiet courage to stop chasing love that had never been willing to meet her halfway.